Hello, dear story lovers. At the amount of 1,000 subscribers, I will post a huge series of special stories for you. Subscribe now. Jake Lawson was no stranger to strange finds. His garage on the outskirts of the Nevada desert was a haven for forgotten machines and junked vehicles, things others had written off as beyond repair. For Jake, though, there was no such thing. His hands were magic, or so his loyal clients liked to say, capable of breathing life into even the rustiest of engines. But even he couldn't have predicted the magnitude of what he'd stumbled across that fateful morning. It started as a routine parts run. Jake was out scavenging for usable scrap in the arid wasteland, where junkyards and forgotten military sites were plentiful. His battered pickup creaked along the cracked, dusty road as his eyes scanned for anything out of place. That's when he saw something metallic glinting in the distance. At first, he thought it was the husk of a plane. Over the years, he'd come across old propeller planes, bombers, and even the occasional experimental craft. But as he drew closer, his seasoned eyes began to pick up oddities in the shape and material. The object was sleek and seamless, like a giant droplet of mercury frozen in midfall. Half buried in the sand, it exuded an eerie stillness, its surface unmarred by time or decay. Jake parked his truck and approached cautiously. The air seemed thicker here, carrying a faint hum he could almost feel in his chest. A strange heat radiated from the object, though the desert sun was far from its zenith. "What in the hell is this?" Jake muttered, running his fingers along the smooth exterior. It was cool to the touch, despite the heat waves rippling across the dunes around him. The more he examined it, the more it became apparent this wasn't a plane, nor any machine made by human hands. The contours were too fluid, the surface too pristine. And the faint markings etched into the metal? They resembled no writing or symbols Jake had ever seen, not in any language or engineering schematic. Curiosity overcame caution. Jake circled the object, searching for a way in. Toward the rear, he found a jagged seam, a crack in the otherwise perfect structure. It looked like something had forced the hatch open from the inside. With a grunt, he wedged a crowbar into the seam and pried. It took all his strength, but the hatch eventually gave way with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside, the world was even stranger. The interior was dimly lit by a soft, pulsating glow emanating from vein-like structures embedded in the walls. The air smelled faintly metallic, tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Consoles with alien controls and translucent screens lined the walls, their symbols blinking weakly. "What is this, some kind of alien RV?" Jake joked to himself, his voice trembling despite the humor. His gaze landed on the pilot's seat, a chair molded to fit a body that was clearly not human. A shiver ran down his spine. Still, the mechanic in him couldn't resist. The ship looked like it was alive, though barely. Its systems flickered sporadically, as though crying out for help. It was damaged, that much was clear, but not irreparably so. For Jake, this wasn't just a curiosity, it was a challenge. He spent the rest of the day hauling tools from his truck to the ship, working under the scorching desert sun. The ship's systems were baffling, yet certain principles felt familiar: power conduits, energy reserves, control nodes. "Electronics are electronics," he muttered as he soldered a connection that had come loose. Alien or not. Hours passed, and by evening, he had managed to coax the ship's main power source into humming softly. A few displays blinked to life, casting a faint glow that painted the interior in shades of blue and green. Symbols scrolled across the screens, their meaning still beyond his grasp, but Jake had a gut feeling he was on the right track. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake stepped out of the ship and gazed up at the stars. They seemed brighter than usual, almost as though they were watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he'd found was far more than a machine. It was waiting for something or someone. Unbeknownst to Jake, his tampering had sent a faint signal pulsing through the cosmos. Miles away, nestled in the shadows of the mountains, something stirred. Eyes that gleamed like molten gold flickered open, their gaze fixed on the distant glint of light on the horizon. Jake had set something in motion, something that would change his life forever. Jake woke to a sound he couldn't place. It wasn't the usual cacophony of the desert, no howling wind, no coyotes, not even the familiar creak of his old truck settling in the cooling night air. Instead, it was a low, rhythmic hum, like the steady pulse of a heartbeat. It was coming from the ship. Blinking sleep from his eyes, he sat up in his makeshift cot outside the ship, bathed in the faint luminescence spilling from the craft's interior. He hadn't expected it to make any noise, let alone this strange, organic vibration. Intrigued, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the ship, which seemed to glow brighter as he entered. The cockpit was alive in a way it hadn't been the previous night. Displays that had been faint and flickering now pulsed with life, casting strange symbols and patterns onto the walls. The hum grew louder as Jake approached the central console. Tentatively, he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers grazed the surface, the ship responded. A cascade of images flooded the nearest display. At first, they were incomprehensible, a swirl of colors and shapes that seemed random. But then, they began to take form, a star map, intricate and alien, with a particular system highlighted in a pulsating red. Alongside it, strings of symbols scrolled rapidly, their meaning still indecipherable. "What are you trying to tell me?" Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. As if in answer, the console emitted a faint burst of light, and a new image appeared. This one was of a planet, lush and vibrant, with deep blue oceans and sprawling green land masses. It was beautiful, but what caught Jake's attention was the overlay of red markers, concentrated in a specific region of the planet. It looked like a warning. Jake's mechanic instincts kicked in. If this ship was trying to communicate, it meant it had some level of intelligence, maybe even sentience. He wasn't just fixing a machine, he was reviving something far more complex. He pulled up a stool and set to work, his hands moving deftly over the controls. He didn't understand the language, but the ship's responses were almost intuitive. Lights brightened when he adjusted certain circuits, and faint tones indicated progress when he activated dormant systems. Hours passed, and Jake became so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice the faint, almost imperceptible whispering at first. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense, it seemed to emanate from the very walls of the ship, a soft, rhythmic cadence that resonated in his mind. He paused, his hands hovering over the console. "Is that you?" he asked aloud, feeling slightly ridiculous for speaking to a machine. But the whispering grew more pronounced, and for a fleeting moment, Jake thought he could discern words. They were faint, fragmented, but undeniably there. Words like help, home, and danger. Jake leaned back, his heart pounding. This was no ordinary ship. It wasn't just damaged, it was alive, and it was scared. The next night, as Jake continued his repairs, the ship revealed more of its secrets. The star map on the central display became interactive, allowing him to zoom in and out with gestures. The highlighted system was unlike anything he'd seen in Earth's astronomy books, its configuration alien and oddly beautiful. He also discovered something else, a small compartment hidden in the rear of the ship. Inside was a device that resembled a tablet, though its surface shimmered like liquid metal. When he touched it, the device sprang to life, projecting a three-dimensional image into the air. It was a recording. The image was of a figure, tall and wolf-like, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a commanding presence. Its voice was deep and melodic, though Jake couldn't understand the language it spoke. The recording played out like a message, the figure gesturing to the star map and then to the planet with the red markers. At the end, the figure placed a hand over its chest, a universal gesture that Jake interpreted as a plea. Jake replayed the recording several times, piecing together what little he could. Whoever this was, they had been the ship's pilot or perhaps its caretaker. And they were in trouble. By now, Jake's repairs had restored most of the ship's primary systems. The hum of its engines was steady, its interior brighter and warmer. Yet the more he fixed, the more Jake felt a growing urgency emanating from the craft. The whispers in the walls became more coherent, urging him to do something, though he still didn't fully understand what. Then, it happened. As Jake was calibrating a particularly stubborn power conduit, the ship emitted a sharp pulse of energy. The lights flickered, and for a moment, Jake thought he'd broken something. But when he looked outside, his heart nearly stopped. In the distance, silhouetted against the moonlit desert, was a figure. It stood tall and still, its form unmistakably alien. Its eyes glowed faintly, catching the ship's light like twin embers. Jake froze, his mind racing. This couldn't be real, could it? Yet as the figure began to move toward him with deliberate grace, he knew that whatever he had awakened in the ship was about to change everything. Jake stood at the ship's open hatch, his flashlight trembling in his hand as the figure drew closer. The faint glow of its eyes, like molten gold, reflected off the metallic sheen of the ship. It moved with an uncanny blend of grace and caution, its wolf-like features now fully visible in the moonlight. Long limbs, fur tinged with shades of silver and black, and a posture that was both animalistic and upright. Jake's instincts told him to run, but curiosity and a strange sense of connection rooted him in place. The figure stopped several feet away, its head tilting slightly, as if studying him. Hi? Jake ventured, his voice cracking. The alien's ears perked at the sound, and it raised a hand, three long, clawed fingers extended in what Jake could only assume was a gesture of peace. The alien then spoke, its voice a deep, resonant growl layered with tonal subtleties Jake couldn't comprehend. The words carried a rhythm that hinted at intelligence and purpose, but Jake could only shrug helplessly. "Sorry, buddy, no clue what you're saying." The alien seemed to consider this. It stepped closer, cautiously, and reached for the ship's hull, placing a hand on its surface. The ship responded immediately. Lights inside flickered, and a faint hum echoed through the air. Symbols Jake hadn't seen before appeared on the central display inside, their meaning still a mystery. "Wait a second," Jake muttered. He turned and climbed back into the cockpit, gesturing for the alien to follow. The figure hesitated but eventually stepped inside, its movements careful as if it didn't want to damage the delicate interior. Once inside, the alien touched the central console. The ship's systems sprang to life with a level of responsiveness Jake hadn't managed to achieve on his own. A new recording played in midair, showing the same wolf-like figure Jake had seen earlier, only this time accompanied by what appeared to be a fleet of ships. The recording zoomed in on the planet with the red markers, its surface now illuminated by flashes of light battlefields, perhaps. The message ended with the wolf-like figure making the same chest-touching gesture Jake had seen in the previous recording. The alien beside him pointed at the display, then at itself. "Rax," it said, the sound deep and guttural. Jake blinked. "That's your name? Rax?" The alien nodded, its golden eyes locking onto Jake's with an intensity that felt both alien and familiar. Then it pointed at Jake, tilting its head expectantly. "Oh, Jake. I'm Jake." He tapped his chest awkwardly. "Jake," Rax repeated, the word strange and thick in its mouth. It sounded like it was trying to swallow gravel and vowels at the same time, but it was close enough to bring a crooked smile to Jake's face. Satisfied with the exchange, Rax gestured to the ship's console, tapping a series of symbols with a precision that left Jake in awe. The cockpit transformed into a projection of the star map, the highlighted system now expanding to reveal detailed routes and coordinates. Rax pointed to the planet with the red markers, then to the ship's engines, and finally to Jake, a clear plea in its eyes. "You want me to fly this thing?" Jake asked, incredulous. Rax growled softly, a sound Jake interpreted as affirmation. The mechanic laughed, shaking his head. "I fix things, pal. I don't fly 'em. But if you're piloting, I can try to keep this bird from falling apart." Rax seemed to understand. It moved to the pilot's seat, its tall frame folding with surprising ease into the alien chair. Jake took his place at the console, scanning the controls he had painstakingly pieced together over the past few days. "All right, Rax," Jake said, glancing over at his new companion. "Let's see what this baby can do." The launch was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. As the ship's engines roared to life, a powerful surge of energy coursed through its hull, making the ground beneath them tremble. Jake held on for dear life as the ship shot into the sky, leaving a trail of dust and light behind. The view outside the cockpit shifted rapidly from desert sand to an endless expanse of stars. Jake's heart raced. He was in space. Actual, honest-to-goodness space. Rax navigated the ship with an expertise that made Jake's head spin. The alien manipulated the controls with fluid precision, steering them through asteroid fields and solar winds like they were minor inconveniences. Meanwhile, Jake focused on keeping the ship's systems operational, adjusting power levels and rerouting energy to compensate for the lingering damage. Hours turned into days as they traveled through the void. Jake learned to communicate with Rax through gestures, drawings, and trial and error. He also discovered more about the ship, which seemed to possess a rudimentary AI that could translate certain symbols into crude, broken English. Through this, he gleaned snippets of Rax's mission, their planet, threatened by a powerful cosmic force, a call for aid that had gone unanswered, and a desperate hope pinned on this ship's ability to return. During one of their quieter moments, Jake found himself staring out the viewport at the swirling nebulae beyond. "You're trying to save your people, aren't you?" he asked, even though he knew Rax couldn't fully understand. The alien's ears twitched, and it let out a soft rumble, a sound Jake interpreted as agreement. Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Well, you picked the right guy to patch things up. Let's hope I'm good enough to get you home." Rax glanced at him, its golden eyes filled with a gratitude Jake didn't need words to understand. Together, they pressed onward, the vastness of space stretching out before them and the faint hope of salvation waiting at the end of their journey. The final stretch of the journey was anything but smooth. As the ship neared Rax's home system, an alert blared through the cockpit. Jake scrambled to decipher the flashing symbols on the console, his heart pounding as he recognized the unmistakable signs of incoming ships. "What now?" he muttered, glancing at Rax. The alien was already leaning forward, its claws flying over the controls. A holographic display expanded before them, showing a fleet of unfamiliar ships moving in formation. They were sharp and angular, a stark contrast to the organic curves of Rax's vessel. Hostile, Jake guessed. Their aggressive maneuvering left little doubt. Rax growled something in its language and pointed at the display, then at Jake. The mechanic frowned. "You want me to... what? Fix something while you handle this?" He was met with a curt nod. Jake bolted from his seat and headed to the engine room, where the hum of the ship's systems had grown erratic. It wasn't surprising. The ship had been dormant for who knew how long, and their rapid flight through space had pushed it to its limits. Sparks flew as he opened a panel, revealing a snarled mess of conduits and damaged power lines. "Hang in there, girl," Jake muttered, pulling a welding torch from his belt. "I'm not letting you die on me now." In the cockpit, Rax deftly maneuvered the ship, evading the hostile fleet's weapons with precision that bordered on instinct. The vessel, though still partially damaged, responded to Rax's commands as if it had been waiting for this moment. Pulses of energy erupted from the enemy ships, but Rax twisted and rolled the ship in ways that left the blasts trailing harmlessly behind. Jake's voice crackled over the comms. "I've got the power stabilized, but you're burning through the reserves faster than I can keep up. What's your plan?" Rax let out a sharp bark of response, the tone conveying urgency even if the words were incomprehensible. A moment later, the holographic display updated, showing a direct course toward the planet. Their goal was within reach, but so was the enemy blockade. Jake returned to the cockpit, sweat streaking his soot-covered face. He dropped into his seat and stared at the display. We're not making it through that without some firepower. Rax pointed to a section of the console Jake hadn't touched before. The alien growled a series of commands, and symbols lit up on the screen. Weapon systems. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized the ship was far more equipped than it appeared. Why didn't you tell me we had guns? Jake exclaimed, throwing himself into action. The controls were alien, but his mechanic's intuition kicked in. With Rax piloting and Jake manning the weapons, the ship transformed from a fleeing target into a formidable combatant. The battle was chaos. Rax's ship weaved through the enemy fleet, firing bursts of energy that exploded in dazzling flashes. Jake's aim was clumsy at first, but with each shot, he grew more confident, learning the patterns and quirks of the ship's armaments. They fought as a team, a seamless blend of Rax's precision and Jake's ingenuity. Finally, they broke through the blockade and entered the atmosphere of Rax's homeworld. The planet was as stunning as the holograms had shown: lush forests, crystalline rivers, and sprawling cities now scarred by the aftermath of battle. Fires burned across the horizon, and towering machines of war loomed over shattered structures. The ship's descent was swift, guided by Rax's intimate knowledge of the terrain. They landed in a clearing near a cluster of surviving buildings. As the hatch opened, Rax leaped out, barking orders to the gathered survivors. Jake followed, his gaze sweeping over the alien faces that stared at him with a mix of awe and suspicion. Rax led him to what appeared to be a command center, its walls lined with holographic maps and displays. The situation was grim, the invading force was relentless, their weapons devastating, and the planet's defenses nearly depleted. Rax pointed to the ship, then to the largest enemy vessel on the map, a hulking behemoth in orbit, coordinating the assault. You want to take that thing out? Jake asked, incredulous. Rax nodded solemnly. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing. All right, he said, exhaling sharply. But we're going to need more power. And I'll have to rig something unconventional. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. Jake spent hours in the ship's engine room, modifying its systems to amplify the main weapon beyond its normal capacity. It was a gamble. The ship might not survive the strain, but neither would the enemy command ship if the plan worked. As the ship ascended back into orbit, Jake felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Rax sat beside him, their shared determination unspoken but palpable. The enemy fleet closed in almost immediately, but this time, Jake and Rax didn't evade. They charged straight for the command ship. The final confrontation was a blur of light and sound. Rax's piloting kept them alive as Jake primed the weapon for its final shot. The ship shook violently, warning alarms blaring, but Jake ignored them. He pulled the trigger. A blinding beam of energy erupted from the ship, piercing the enemy command vessel in a single, devastating strike. The explosion that followed lit up the dark void of space, scattering debris and sending the remaining enemy ships into disarray. The victory was hard-won. The ship limped back to the planet, its systems barely holding together. As they landed amidst a cheering crowd of survivors, Jake collapsed back into his seat, exhausted but triumphant. Rax approached him as the crowd surged forward, their golden eyes filled with gratitude. The alien placed a hand over its chest, then extended it toward Jake. The mechanic hesitated, then mirrored the gesture. "You're welcome," Jake said with a tired grin. "But next time, let's keep the repairs on the ground." Rax rumbled a sound that Jake swore was laughter. Together, they stepped out to face the crowd, a human and an alien whose bond had defied the boundaries of species and space. For the first time, Jake felt like more than just a mechanic. He felt like a hero.